Welcome to our next discipleship class. Today we are going to walk through some views on atheism and their perspectives. So, atheism is inherently self-defeating. I believe it is a self-conflicting philosophy and viewpoint. I'll try to make that clear today. And as we walk through this, hopefully by the time we end, and we'll see if this will go more than one session, it will make clear why I believe and can demonstrate that atheism is a self-defeating philosophy and worldview. So, as we start out, we'll follow this outline. 3 arguments support theism, and we'll look at those. We'll look into how atheism fails in its reasoning, and then we'll have some concluding thoughts. So as we walk through this, let's start with the 3 arguments that support theism. So we know the cosmological argument, which is the universe had a beginning, is the first argument that we would look at for theism. The second is the design or teleological argument, and that is there is a design in nature, and therefore there's got to be a designer behind it. And then the moral argument, which morality is universal. There is a moral law, so there must be a moral law giver. So let's first of all look at the cosmological argument. It is an objective argument. It is not a subjective argument. In other words, the object is the cosmos. The argument is not subjective, relating to my own bias. So the universe, the time, space, matter universe, right, had a beginning and is not eternal. So this is review for most of you. Everything that has a beginning requires a beginner. That is straightforward, and we know that from the law of causality. That's how all of science works. Everything that has a beginning has to have a beginner. Somebody has to do it. In the case of the universe, the universe has to have a person or a being that creates it that is, first of all, eternal and non-contingent. This being does not need the universe in order to exist, because the universe had to come into existence at some point in time. And since time is a part of the time, space, matter universe, then the being would have to be timeless. In other words, in order to create time. These are logical necessities. He would have to be spaceless, in other words, to create space. He would have to be immaterial to create matter, right? Matter does not give rise to matter. No matter how long it takes, matter cannot give rise to matter. If matter doesn't exist, it can't create itself. It's the bottom line. It has to be intelligent. This is evident in the design of all living systems and everything else. Purposeful, which means he had to have a will to create. Powerful, to create from nothing and sustain all that is made. There are other attributes. Personal, in order to want to create, and also moral, because there's a moral law. We can get into a lot of aspects, but these are at least fundamental to the nature of the being that would have to exist, working effect to cause, reasoning our way back to that would need to exist in order for the universe to exist. Now, denying the cosmological argument is to deny the law of causality. To say that the cosmological argument is not valid, then we have to get outside of the law of causality. We have to say the law of causality works everywhere except for where we don't want it to work. That doesn't fly. So that won't pass the smell test or anything else. It doesn't matter how many flowery words you put around it, or very intellectual statements or concepts that you try to develop, the bottom line is there is no evidence for anything to exist without something else bringing it into existence. Now, we have an original first cause, which would be the being that we just talked about, but denying the cosmological argument really ultimately denies the law of causality. The law of causality is foundational to the scientific method. Ignoring or denying the law of causality, first of all, is unscientific, right? Atheists claim they are the ones that observe science. Well, then that means you can't just cast off the law of causality. You can't cast it off when it doesn't fit the atheistic narrative. You still have to maintain integrity with the scientific method. It's unreasonable. Atheists claim they are the ones that use reason above faith. Well, if that's the case, then how do they conclude that the cosmological argument in any way would not be valid? In other words, it's not reasonable to deny the law of causality, especially when all of science utilizes that, and it is a consistent law that everybody bases everything they do on that. It denies all, to deny the cosmological argument, right, denies all accumulated knowledge, right? Atheists claim to be more intellectual than theists, but deny the scientific and self-evident knowledge that defines a person as being intellectual. So you can't deny all the knowledge we have that would tell us that we work from effect back to cause to discover the cause of all things. And if everything in the universe had to have a cause, then the cause has to be greater than the time-space-matter universe. And if you want to be intellectual, you have to come to those conclusions. Now, atheists attempt to avoid the law of causality by promoting, first of all, the multiverse. Well, the multiverse it's a nice story. It's something great to talk about, I guess, at dinner parties. But the reality is there is zero evidence for it. You can talk about it all day long, but there's no evidence for the multiverse. It just doesn't exist. It exists in people's minds. It exists as something to have a conversation about, but it does not exist in reality. It is not there. There's no evidence of it. There's no way to devise evidence for it. And even if the multiverse in some fashion existed, it would still require an original first cause, an uncaused cause, because the multiverse would be just a bunch of time-space matter universes. So you're actually multiplying the problem on the atheistic side. You're not solving anything. It's a mythical concept with no evidence. So atheists tend to avoid the law of causality by promoting the natural law of the gaps, or what I call the natural law of the gaps. In other words, atheists place faith in what they don't know and equivocate on the word science. So this becomes a problem because they start changing the definition. They start to talk about nature in a way that natural law cannot function. You can't give natural law more time and then somehow we'll figure out that natural law gave rise to natural law. Nature cannot give rise to nature. Material that does not exist cannot create itself. It's just not possible. So trying to plug something in there that will never be there is what I call the natural law of the gaps. Miracles in natural law. I think atheists tend to think that nature somehow created nature, which would be a miracle that natural law cannot produce. Nature can't do it. So you're basically saying that in the decision point of did a being create everything or did nothing create everything, they would prefer that nothing created everything, which is, again, violating the law of causality and just kind of making it up in the beginning. Faith in the future. Atheists don't like to talk about faith because they feel that faith is something that is without evidence. Well, this is a great example. Many atheists believe someday in the future scientists will discover what is unknown today, which is faith, or fantasy if you want to call it that nature will somehow give rise to nature, or they'll figure out how it did. Here's the bottom line. To make a case, we must argue from what we know, not from what we would like to know. What I know today, what everybody knows scientifically, is the law of causality, how it functions, and based on what I know, I argue from what I know, in effect, back to cause. That's how I come to those conclusions. Now, I can say what I would like to be there, that's not there, that I hope will be there to prove my point as an atheist in the future, but that does not make it happen. The universe, by what we know, had to come from nothing, no thing. The universe had to have a beginning point. It doesn't matter what you want to talk about with different theories and speculations. The bottom line is it had to have a starting point. And that's not Lawrence Krauss's quantum vacuum or anything like that. It has to be no thing. Like I think it was Aristotle that said, nothing is what rocks dream about. Well, that's nothing. Zero. Nothing. Does not exist. As I heard Frank Turek say one time, when I say that I had nothing for lunch, it's not that I ate something called nothing. It was that I didn't have any lunch. There was nothing. Zero. Right? So evidenceless theories and miracles within naturalistic framework is self-defeating. So even though naturalists like to claim they don't believe in miracles, their starting point, for the most part, if they eliminate God, is a miracle beyond what even theists believe, because at least theists believe a being made what is existing in the universe instead of it making itself when it came from nothing. The design argument is observationally objective. Easy for me to say. So, again, this is another objective argument from observation, right? All design requires a designer. That's the argument. Designs require intelligence, which is obvious, self-evident. The fine-tuning into the universe is evidence of design, right? Now, there are too many factors to ignore. You can see my video, my apologetics video on this channel, and you can watch that for more detail on the fine-tuning into the universe or the design argument. But there's just too many factors to ignore. The accumulation of the anthropic principle alone, and then you start adding in all the other pieces that are there. We wouldn't be here if anything was off just a non-measurable, minute change in the development of the universe or living systems. So biological systems are evidence of design, right? So DNA alone provides evidence of design. You can't have 3.2 billion pieces of information in your DNA and then all of a sudden say that somehow just kind of accumulated on its own, just happened to fall into the sequences that made everything else so that it would develop into the people that we are today with the complex systems that we possess. DNA alone provides evidence of design. To say that DNA is random is deliberately putting on blinders. There's enough information capacity in a single human cell to store the Encyclopedia Britannica, all 30 volumes of it, 3 or 4 times over. This is a quote from The Blind Watchmaker, Why the Evidence of Evolution Reveals a Universe Without Design by Richard Dawkins. Now, think about that. He is giving you evidence of design in a book that says there's no design. In his book, The Blind Watchmaker, on page 1, he tells us that there is no design in living systems. There's just there's just an appearance of design. So that's a little bit absurd. To deny design is to deny our senses. I mean, how else do we know what design is if we do not use our senses to observe and reason out the conclusions that we come to? If I can't believe my own senses, whose senses am I to believe, right? So here's the quote: "Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose." Richard Dawkins, page 1. I don't know if you would really put that on page 1 of a book that is going to have the rest of the book say that everything isn't designed. So apparently I'm supposed to believe Richard Dawkins' senses and deny my own. How about Francis Crick in What Mad Pursuit? He says, "Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed but rather evolved." Why do they need to constantly keep that in mind? Because it's natural to look at what is there and come to the conclusion that they are design systems. They work too intricately and too much in an organized fashion, which cannot have just randomly evolved without intelligence. So the obvious conclusion, even from Francis Crick, is that you got to keep telling yourself that there's no design here, no design, no design. You know, it reminds me when I was a kid, they come out with a movie. It was supposed to be so scary in the advertisements and the trailer. You know, part of the trailer was just keep telling yourself, it's only a movie, it's only a movie, right? Well, apparently Crick feels as though when you actually study biological systems and living systems, that when you look at them, they're screaming design so much. You got to keep saying no design, no design. So I guess that's the mantra that you're supposed to repeat as a scientist, because you have to deny your senses. You just have to accept Francis Crick's senses and Richard Dawkins' senses, and apparently then you're okay. Well, maybe my senses are so confused that I don't even know what their book is saying. How do I know that? If I deny my senses, then my senses tell me that their book doesn't make any sense, so I think I'll stick with my own senses. But if I can't believe my own senses, should I believe them when I read the quotes by both Dawkins and Crick if they conflict with my natural senses? I don't think so. Why am I told that what looks like design is not design? How can I know design when I see it if I can't trust my own observations? That's madness. That's absurd. I mean, are we supposed to just throw everything away and then blindly march behind the Pied Piper? I mean, this is ridiculous. You know, that intelligent men come up with this stuff should be very, very evident to everybody that reads or listens to them, that what they are saying does not make sense. They're avoiding the obvious. Design is objectively observable to all of our senses. These same senses are used to practice science by all scientists. Selecting when to believe our own observation, in other words, using our senses, is not consistent, is not reasonable, is not intellectual, and is not science. You know, you don't selectively decide, well, I'll trust my senses when I'm reading Richard Dawkins, but when I'm looking at it myself, I can't do that. I mean, it's kind of a cultic mentality. You can't have it both ways, though atheists want to dictate the terms. If I have to run all my observations through the Dawkins-Crick filter, I've just defeated the purpose of scientific inquiry that is foundational to all scientific discovery. I can't even be a scientist anymore if I am one. I just have to go find out what they tell me is true and then not do my own experiments and come to my own conclusions. This is not science, it's madness, and is a roadblock to learning and advancement. And anybody that thinks that that is science and that somehow is enlightenment as an atheist really is not looking at the facts and is missing the whole point. How about morality? The third proof that theism exists. Let's take a look at that. So, morality is self-evident. There is a moral law which requires a moral lawgiver. All people have a sense of morality, in other words, right and wrong behaviors. Everybody has that. Knowing morality does not account for its existence. The mere fact that it exists does not account for its existence. You can't just say, well, we have morality because we have morality. Or I have this moral inclination that certain things are right and wrong because I have this moral inclination that some things are right and wrong. Now, that doesn't really fly. So epistemology is the study of knowledge, or how we know what we know. And that's really what you were dealing with when we're dealing with morality. When we say we know morality, we know it because of what is in us, and it is an epistemological argument to just talk about it, right? Morality is prescriptive and the law that transcends man who innately perceives of its existence. So, just so we understand, and there's a distinction that needs to be made, sociology is descriptive and must be distinguished from morality, which is prescriptive. A prescription is, you go to the doctor and he prescribes something and you are obligated to take it if you want to get well, okay? But that's a prescription. It is something that is prescribed for you. It is something that is placed upon you, something that has an obligation to it. You are obligated to take the medication if you want to get well. Well, that's not what sociology is. Sociology it just talks about what happens in societies. It just describes what people do. That's not morality. In sociology, you can say that 51% of the people do this in this society, but that doesn't make it right. That just means that more people are doing it than not doing it. But there's no obligation. Peer pressure is not obligation for morality. So when you're in a society, and just because the majority of the people are doing it, that doesn't make it objectively right. And that doesn't make it morally right. That just means that more people are doing it than not doing it. But we'll get into a little more of this. Sociology does not tell us how to behave, which is the point. Morality tells us how to behave prescriptively. That is the issue when it comes to morality. The moral law exists. The question is not what everybody consents morally. This would be the result if morality is imposed by a transcendent moral lawgiver. In other words, everybody has a sense of morality because it's imposed on us from the moral lawgiver that transcends us, right? Morality transcends us. We do not fix morality. We talk about morality. We can understand morality. We can point to moral or immoral behavior. We can make all those decisions, but we do not create it, okay? It is there imposed on everybody. It's not a bottom-up creation that some biological system, sprung into existence, this concept that is non-material about my moral inclinations that everybody seems to have. It is a top-down. It comes from outside of us, right? From the moral lawgiver. The question is, why all sense morality? Which is the ontological issue and answered by the transcendent moral lawgiver. So the question isn't epistemological, in other words, how I know what I know. The issue is ontological. Why does morality exist in the first place? Why is it there? Why do certain things bother me? Why do I think some things are right and some things are wrong? Now, I may disagree with the next person on certain issues, but on the main issues of morality, everybody is, for the most part, on the same page. And you know that not by their acts, but by their reaction to what people do to them. Everybody thinks that, thieves think taking other people's stuff is great until somebody steals their stuff. and then they don't like it, which tells us what? That they think that that's a wrong thing to do. Otherwise, I mean, they wouldn't be stealing and then saying, well, it's okay. And then when somebody steals from me, saying it's not okay. See, that tells you what they actually believe, regardless of what they state. Atheists consistently argue epistemologically and ignore the ontological issue of morality. Knowing morality does not account for it. It gives no reason for it. The moral dilemmas exist because morality exists. There's times that we get into these complex moral issues and we call them a moral dilemma, but the moral dilemmas would not exist if morality did not exist ontologically. We would just make it go away, but we can't make it go away, all right? Because everybody has the sense. So a moral dilemma does not mean there's no solution. It just means that it's a harder solution than the easy ones. Claiming moral relativism is not only self-defeating by claiming it's an absolute truth, and it can't be true. In other words, if I say, well, moral relativism is true and there are no moral absolutes, I'm making an absolute claim that there are no moral absolutes. So it's self-defeating. It's the law of non-contradiction. So in trying to claim there's no moral absolutes, I'm making a claim that can't sustain its own principle. And so at that point, I'm just in self-contradiction. I don't make any sense. But there would be no moral dilemma or universal sense of morality to argue unless it was imposed by the transcendent moral lawgiver. And that is the point that we're trying to make here. Evolution and social structures cannot account for the existence of morality. Granting macroevolution is true, though all evidence is against or contradicts it. I'm not saying I believe in macroevolution. I'm saying, granting that it's true for our discussion right now, it's a biological system that cannot give rise to non-material aspects of man's thinking and consciousness. Can't do it. Not even within the evolutionary framework. You can talk about it all you want to, but there is nothing that will... The same thing as a rock cannot turn into a person, no matter how much time you give it, okay? Abiogenesis. You can't make people out of rocks. The time element has no help on that, all right? We know that from what? We know that from the law of causality. We know that from the scientific method. We understand that. A scientist that would say, if you leave a rock alone, eventually it'll turn into a living system, is lying. And they know they're lying, okay? Because that's against all knowledge and everything that we know. So to say that you can take a biological system that's living and then all of a sudden start to get non-material concepts from it is an absurdity. There's no way that you're going to get thinking and consciousness from a bunch of atoms. It doesn't work, and we know that. There's no sense of morality in the animal world. Now, animals obviously have a consciousness, okay? They're not self-conscious. They don't get up in the morning and take a look at themselves in the mirror and say, man, you look awful today. They don't do that. They're not self-conscious, but they do have a consciousness to some measure because they have life, okay? But in the animal world, time and biology cannot create morality, which is a non-material part of us, human beings. So, you can give the lion all the time you want. He's never going to feel bad about making lunch out of the gazelle. It's not going to happen, okay? Time is not going to change that. Time is not going to develop an animal to the place where all of a sudden they have thinking concepts, okay? No matter how you slice it, that is never going to occur. Social structures use morality to construct moral laws, right, in all countries, but only because of their universal existence. The only reason that you can have societal laws is because everybody in society, bar none, has a sense of an ultimate morality and that things are right and wrong. And that's why they can sit down, and though some societies have made some pretty bad laws, that's not the point. The point is that everybody has a sense that people need to have this obligation to follow right and wrong behaviors. That's what establishing a law is. All laws are moral. It just depends on where the morality is going to be grounded. Is it going to be grounded in somebody's opinion or the ultimate moral lawgiver, God? So from this standpoint, social structures use morality because it exists. They don't create it. It's already there in everybody that lives in that society. Atheists sense, know, want, vote, argue, and choose, that should be choose, moral positions on existing ethical subjects. They all do that. All atheists do that. Atheists function just like theists. We're all made the same. Whether we believe in God or don't believe in God, that does not change our moral structure. We all have a sense, we all know, we all want, we all vote, we all argue, we all choose, right? And these are all ethical subjects. These are all decisions based on value judgments or something else. What I sense is right and wrong behavior or something else. But they're all choices that we make. And these have nothing to do with coming from a biological system. People cannot live without these moral positions. And to reject or change any view on morality is a moral position itself, right? So if I say, well, no, we need to do this differently, that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean morality is relative. That means that I have an absolute view and I want to change how this view affects people by this law I want changed or whatever. But the mere fact that I want to change it means I'm changing it to something else, right? The law of non-contradiction, right? Two things can't be the opposite and true at the same time in the same sense. So if I change something, I'm actually using the law of non-contradiction. This law that I want to change to is not the same as the law we have. I want it changed. So my choice in changing that is evidence of the fact that I am utilizing as an argument to develop a law that is not the current law. It's not the same. It's a law, right? It's a moral law because it's going to describe what behavior is acceptable and not acceptable in this society, but at the same time, it's also telling me that laws are absolute because if you violate them, you go to jail, right? So that is the punishment for laws. So they're not relative. Laws, whether societal or the moral law within our hearts, written on our conscience, it's the same thing. They're still absolute in the sense that they are laws. Morality is universal and known by people's reaction to perceived immoral actions against them, not by their silly claims about morality. I mentioned this earlier, right? Steal from, hurt a loved one of, bankrupt or other damage an atheist's life from what they would like it to be, and they will claim it is wrong and immoral. So if you hurt an atheist, if you hurt one of their loved ones, you bankrupt them, you do some damage to them, right? And change their life from what they would like it to be to what you change it to. And I can't see any of them saying, wow, thanks a lot. I really appreciate you sending me to jail unjustly. Of course not. They're going to say, wait a minute, that's wrong. Why is it wrong? Because we all have a sense of right and wrong. We all know what right and wrong is. And to argue against it is ridiculous. It's silly. Their desire for what they perceive as justice and even retribution for hurtful acts against them make the case that they believe two things. First, there is a universal moral law, since they want its obligation imposed on the perceived offender. And, number two, the universal law they want exacted is absolute. It's not relative, right? They would not accept the offender's claim that what was true for the perceived victim, in this case, was not true for the perceived offender. All morality becomes absolute rather quickly. So, if you burn down somebody's house and then you say, hey, they need to pay for me to have a new house. Well, that's true for you, but not for me. That doesn't fly. It doesn't work. Nobody lives like that. That's absolutely ridiculous. And to argue like that just in dealing with God and morality is really equivocating. And it's sidestepping the issue and just trying to obscure the obvious at that point. Prior to any of these previous arguments for theism, atheism fails before they get started. This is the key that I'm trying to get across in this presentation. Assuming God does not exist, if there is no God, there is no framework that exists for atheists to argue from. In other words, they can't even develop an argument if there's no God because they don't have a mind to do that. All right? Atheists must use a theistic framework in order to even argue their points, which are nullified by the fact that an atheistic framework would not have what they need to make their points. An atheistic framework is void of any non-material aspects of a mind, of thinking, of reasoning, of logic, of preference, of value, of morality. All those are non-existent in an atheistic worldview. An atheistic framework, not only would probably nothing exist, but there would be no place for it to come from in the first place. And even if you could somehow accept the fact that evolution in the material world developed upwardly and developed to the point where certain systems were working biologically, that does not give rise to any of these thinking principles or value judgments or decisions that people are making. They are entirely separate and transcend the biology that we're dealing with in evolution. The mere fact that atheists argue for their position argues against atheism. They argue based on, number one, reason, logic, and evidence. But these uses of these human capabilities and observations are non-existent in an atheistic universe without God. They don't exist. There is no reason, there is no logic, they're transcendent, and there's no evidence. Evidence for what? There's no way to think or reason in dealing with evidence. It doesn't exist. Actually, if God didn't exist, there would be no laws. We talk about the law of gravity. Well, who keeps that going? Who started it and keeps it going? Why doesn't it change? Why doesn't the law of electromagnetism change? Why don't the strong and weak nuclear forces, why don't they all just kind of randomly change? What keeps them fixed? What keeps them going? All right? What keeps all systems, biological systems, goal-directed? Why can we send a Mars rover, calculate, and hit Mars, even though it's so far away? How does that happen? That doesn't happen by accident. It's because nature is goal-directed, and we discover that things lay out in the universe mathematically. So we can triangulate and align and calculate, okay, because everything is orderly. But in order for it to be orderly, it has to have an orderer. Things just don't just happen like that. I mean, I think that you understand where I'm going here. Now, we're at about 40 minutes. There's still a pretty good amount to the rest of the presentation. I know I've actually given you quite a bit to think about. If you're a Christian, I'd recommend that you kind of walk through the slides again and then, try to follow the reasoning process that I'm laying out here. Some of it obviously is review for those of you who understand apologetics. And if you're an atheist, look, I appreciate you even hanging in with us if you're still here after 40 minutes. If you're still listening to me, I got to commend you. But at the same time, I'm asking you to appeal to your own reasonable senses and try to follow the logic that I'm presenting here, because the things that you are utilizing as a human being, even what you're thinking right now, probably as you're listening to me, even if you're thinking, this guy's nuts, he's not making sense, he doesn't understand, and then you're going through these reasons in your mind, that wouldn't be there if God didn't exist. If God didn't exist, if this was not a theistic universe and a theistic framework, then you would not have the capacity to even be thinking what you're thinking and trying to decide how I'm wrong. Think about that. So I know we got a ways to go on this, but we'll hopefully finish it up next week. So it's an interesting presentation, interesting perspective. So until then, may God richly bless you as you open your heart to Him on these issues and ask Him for the ability to think through these things and as you study His Word.